Hello and welcome. If you're keeping a close eye on major global economic shifts, particularly those affecting India, and I know many of you preparing for the UPSC exams are, you're in the right place.
Absolutely.
We're diving into the recent U.S. announcement on reciprocal tariffs. It's definitely making waves in international trade.
It really is.
Today, we're going to unpack the key insights from the Hindu to help you get a clear handle on what this means, especially for India, without getting bogged down in jargon.
Right. The goal is clarity.
Our mission here is really to distill the essential information, make sense of this new tariff structure.
And it's important to remember there are really two main parts to this new setup.
Okay.
You've got the existing tariffs, the ones based on specific commodities, and then layered on top is this new reciprocal tariff, which is country-specific.
Okay. So two layers. Got it.
Keeping those distinct is, I think, key to understanding the whole picture.
So let's focus on that new layer then, the reciprocal tariff. What's the detail there?
Well, fundamentally, it's country-specific. And right now, for most countries, it's capped at 10%.
Okay.
But that's just for an initial 90-day review period. And it's worth noting China isn't under that cap.
Right. China's often a special case in these things.
Indeed. What's also really interesting, especially from maybe a policy perspective, is how they calculate it. It's not using traditional factors like economic elasticity, how demand changes with price.
Yeah.
Instead, this formula really hones in on the trade imbalance between the U.S. and the specific country.
So it's purely about the dollar value, the import-export gap, not the type of goods.
Pretty much, yeah. It's focused squarely on that imbalance.
And how does that calculation work out for India based on what the Hindu reported? What are the numbers?
Okay, so the report mentions India exporting about $41.8 billion to the U.S.
Right.
And importing around $87.4 billion from the U.S.
Okay, so a definite imbalance there.
Exactly. And when you run those numbers through the formula they're using, it gives India a reciprocal tariff rate of 26%.
Wow, 26%. That's quite a jump. So just to be clear, that 26% is added on top of any duties already in place.
Yes, that's correct. It stacks onto the existing commodity-specific tariffs.
Okay.
And the Hindu also highlights something important. There's a minimum floor. It's 10% for countries that aren't exempt.
So even if the original tariff was, say, 5%, this brings it up to at least 10%, or adds the 26% on top.
Well, the 26% is added, but the total effective rate for many items from non-exempt countries effectively gets that 10% minimum applied through this mechanism, plus any specific existing tariffs. It's a bit complex, but that 26% is the key addition for India, subject to that overall context.
Gotcha. Are there exemptions? You mentioned some countries might be exempt. What about sectors?
Yes, definitely. And this points towards a more selective approach. Pharmaceuticals are exempt.
Okay, that makes sense. Essential goods.
Right. Energy is also exempt, and certain specific metals, too.
So it's not across the board. It seems like a targeted protectionist measure in some ways.
That's a fair way to put it, yes. Protecting some domestic industries, perhaps, while avoiding disruption in others deemed critical.
Okay, that paints a clearer picture of the mechanism. So let's turn to India specifically. With this 26% reciprocal tariff coming into play, which Indian export sectors does the Hindu see as being most vulnerable?
Well, first it's worth noting, and the Hindu points this out, while 26% sounds alarming, the context matters.
Okay.
India's exports to the U.S. have actually been sort of tapering off recently, and crucially, they're a relatively small slice of India's total GDP.
So the overall macroeconomic hit might be moderated.
Exactly. It might not be a massive systemic shock, but yes, certain sectors are definitely going to feel the pinch more than others.
And which ones are those? Where's the pressure point?
The report flags areas like electrical machinery and also machinery and mechanical appliances. Made-up textiles are another key one.
Textiles, right. That's a big export category.
It is. Gems and jewelry are also mentioned. But the analysis there suggests maybe a lesser impact because demand is relatively inelastic.
Meaning people will likely still buy them, even if the price goes up a bit.
Sort of, yes. Price isn't the only factor there. And interestingly, mineral fuels are on the list too.
Mineral fuels. But doesn't India import a lot of energy?
It does. The Hindu clarifies that these are mainly re-exports. So goods imported and then exported again, perhaps after some processing, it adds a bit of nuance.
That's a helpful breakdown. But is India facing this 26% alone? Or are its competitors in the U.S. market also seeing similar hikes?
That's a really critical question for understanding the relative impact. And the Hindu makes a strong point here. India's main competitors think China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh. They're also facing high reciprocal tariffs.
Oh, really? So it's not just India?
Not at all. This shared burden, you could say, might actually create more of a level playing field than if India were singled out.
Interesting. Any specific examples, like in electronics?
Yeah. The article mentions South Korea, a big competitor in electronics, faces a tariff rate of 25%, very similar to India's 26%.
So the pain is shared, which might limit how much ground Indian exporters actually lose relative to their competition.
Precisely. It potentially limits the relative competitive disadvantage.
Okay, that puts a different spin on it. Given this landscape, then, what strategic options does the Hindu suggest India explore? A tit-for-tat tariff war sounds counterproductive.
Extremely counterproductive. The Hindu is quite clear on that. They argue strongly against retaliation like we've seen between the US and China.
Right, where tariffs just kept escalating.
Exactly. Up to 245% in some cases. For India, that approach wouldn't work well.
Why not?
Because a large chunk of India's imports from the US are essential goods, things India needs. Putting tariffs on those would mostly just raise prices domestically in India.
Hurt Indian consumers and businesses more than the U.S., potentially.
That's the risk, yes. It likely wouldn't inflict enough pain on the U.S. to be an effective negotiating tactic.
So if a trade war is off the table, what else? The article mentioned something about tactically reducing the rate. How would that work?
Yes, this is quite an interesting strategic angle. The Hindu suggests India could potentially lower its own calculated reciprocal tariff rate.
How? By changing the trade balance.
Exactly, by increasing the value of imports from the U.S., particularly in sectors that aren't highly sensitive domestically, like petroleum products.
Okay, so buy more American oil, for instance. Could that actually make a difference to the rate?
Potentially, yes. The article even gives a specific example.
Let's hear it.
It suggests that if India increased its U.S. oil imports by around, say, $25 billion,
Okay.
that could, mathematically, bring India's reciprocal tariff rate down to about 11.8%.
Wow, from 26% down near the 10% floor. That's significant.
It is. And crucially, the Hindu notes this wouldn't necessarily worsen India's overall current account deficit.
How? Because you're just swapping one import source for another.
Essentially, yes. You'd be changing the composition of the deficit, shifting oil imports from maybe Middle Eastern suppliers to the U.S. It could be a strategically useful move.
That's a fascinating tactical option. What other responses does the article recommend? Diplomacy.
Absolutely. Proactive and sustained consultations with U.S. trade officials are stressed as being vital.
So, keep talking.
Yeah.
Try to find common ground.
Yes. Engage constructively. Explore maybe a broader trade framework that works better for both countries' interests.
Makes sense.
And at the same time, India needs to be watchful, vigilant against dumping.
Dumping. You mean other countries hit by U.S. tariffs trying to offload cheap goods onto the Indian market?
Exactly that. Especially potentially from China. That's a risk India needs to guard against.
So it's a mix of strategic trade adjustments, diplomacy, and defensive measures. What about support for specific Indian industries that are hit hard?
Yes, the article covers that too. It says India really needs to analyze which sectors are most vulnerable again. Think electrical machinery, mechanical appliances, textiles.
Right.
And for those, consider maybe some short-term support. Things like export incentives, perhaps. Also, really pushing for market diversification, finding other buyers beyond the U.S., and longer term, working on improving the domestic competitiveness of those sectors.
Makes sense. And what about the sectors that are doing okay or are exempt?
Well, the flip side is that those sectors, gems and jewelry, pharmaceuticals, could perhaps be prioritized in India's export strategy towards the U.S., leaning into the areas less affected.
Okay, that's a clear set of potential domestic responses. Now, zooming out again, this U.S. action, it feels like part of a bigger trend, doesn't it? How does the Hindu frame this in terms of the global trading order, the WTO?
It definitely frames it as part of a larger pattern. The Hindu explicitly links these tariffs to a broader global shift towards, well, more nationalistic trade policies.
A move away from multilateralism.
Precisely. A move away from the principles that have kind of guided global trade for decades. The article expresses real concern about this.
Concern about what specifically?
About the risk of the global system becoming fragmented. You know, a patchwork of different tariff rules based on bilateral fights rather than agreed upon global standards. That could seriously undermine trade stability.
So where does the World Trade Organization fit into this picture, according to the article? Does it still have a role?
A critical role. Absolutely critical. The Hindu emphasizes that the WTO is really essential for trying to restore some kind of balance.
Wow.
By pushing for a return to Ideally, universally low and rational tariff structures, that's seen as vital for global economic growth.
Better than just regional trade blocs.
The article suggests so. While regional deals might offer temporary benefits for members, a cohesive global system under the WTO framework is seen as ultimately superior for everyone in the long run.
But the WTO itself has faced challenges.
It has. And that's why the article stresses the urgent need for WTO reforms. Reforms that reinforce fairness, transparency, and genuine cooperation among members.
Okay, so bring this all together then. For our listeners, especially those tracking this for UPSC preparation, what's the main takeaway from the Hindu's analysis of these U.S. tariffs?
I think the core message is that these reciprocal tariffs signal a definite shift towards a more transactional approach to international trade by the U.S. It's more about bilateral deals and immediate imbalances.
Yeah, and for India?
For India, the analysis strongly suggests that a pragmatic, measured, and non-confrontational response is probably the wisest course.
Because India is integrated globally, but maybe not so heavily dependent on the U.S. market that it needs to provoke a major fight.
That seems to be the reasoning, yes. Balancing its global supply chain integration with its moderate direct trade exposure to the U.S., understanding this delicate balance and the potential strategies is definitely key for anyone studying India's economic policy.
And those strategies, again, just to recap.
It's a combination. Intelligently recalibrating imports, like that oil example, engaging actively in diplomacy with the U.S., and, crucially, aligning with global trade norms and working to strengthen multilateral bodies like the WTO. It's about strategically repositioning India in this changing global landscape.
That provides a really solid framework for understanding this complex situation. Thanks for breaking that down so clearly.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, if this deep dive helps you make sense of this important development, please do hit like, subscribe to stay updated, and feel free to drop any further questions in the comments. We do read them and appreciate the engagement.
Yes, absolutely.
Just a reminder that our main source for today's discussion was The Hindu. As a final thought to leave you with, how might these ongoing shifts in global trade policy prompt a deeper reevaluation of India's long-term economic strategies? And what role can institutions like the WTO play in safeguarding its interests going forward? Something to ponder. Thanks for tuning in.